So welcome back to part two of our discussion with our Parabukas colleagues on the Kunming Biodiversity Convention that was held in October, middle of October, and concluded, I think, on the 15th of October. We're here today with the co-founder of Parabukas, Nina Guiao, and also the programs manager, Nicole Torres. Welcome back, and thank you very much for coming back and sharing your ideas about biodiversity with us again today. So last time we were looking, in general, about a whole range of issues in terms of biodiversity and relation with climate change. So in terms of the COP, we also talked about ecological civilization. So perhaps I can ask you first, in terms of the Kunming Declaration, which talk about ecological civilization, building a shared future for all life on Earth. How did you think that encapsulated some of the discussions leading up to the Kunming COP and some of the issues that people have been raising about biodiversity and the need for greater biodiversity protection? I mean, was it enough? Was it a good declaration? Did it cover the issues that needed to be covered?
Well, the Kunming Declaration was adopted after the high-level segment at the first part of CBD COP15, which was held from October 11th to 15th in Kunming. This was a blended COP, which means that there were delegates who were there in person, so notably the countries and the civil society organizations that already had a presence in China. But a whole lot of other delegates and participants were only able to do so online. The Kunming Declaration, I think they took care to specify as a non-negotiated and non-legally binding document. This was, I think, in part due to concerns raised by the negotiators from Japan. So it's specifically non-negotiated and specifically not legally binding, but I think that it was very important to China to have this outcome at the first part of the COP to keep, in their words, the political momentum going for the second half of the negotiations that will happen next year. So in that regard, it's a very general declaration. It has broad commitments like ensuring the development, adoption, and implementation of the forthcoming post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. It makes mention of the pandemic, so they note that there's a need to ensure that post-pandemic policies and recovery plans are compatible with the objectives of the convention. And then there's a bit in it as well about integrated approaches, such as ecosystems-based approaches or the One Health approach, and how this all fits together. But it's not. It doesn't provide a lot of detail on how we're getting there. I think that they're leaving that up to the negotiations on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, where decisions won't be made until they meet in person.
And so in terms of that post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, I mean, what are the key elements that are being still negotiated? Is it likely to be something that is strongly committed to no net loss or living in harmony? These seem to be very less clear, less prescriptive objectives, and I didn't see within the text a sort of perhaps the cry of the heart that was in Paris, that we are facing potentially global biodiversity collapse and catastrophe. I didn't see that anywhere in the declaration. It still talks about working towards objectives and goals, but I didn't necessarily see any announcement of emergency or urgency.
Well,
is that something that was there in the discussions, or is that something that's there in the negotiating positions of countries in terms of the framework? Nina, Nicole?
Well, most of the negotiations have happened online. So while countries have stressed the urgency to come up with an ambitious and inclusive and a fully supported and implementable post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Somehow that hasn't found its way into the text that's been proposed as yet. The first draft of the framework was released in July, so July 2021. But almost immediately after, in September, there was another meeting of the open-ended working group. So whatever the text was in July is already substantially bracketed with the strike-throughs and the bold text. So in that there is more of an emphasis on the urgency to act, but the working group hasn't put it all together to come up with a new iteration quite yet.
And I mean, Nina, how does that sort of compare with the background to the Paris negotiations? I mean, we know that the Paris Agreement, it came together at the last moment. There was a lot of negotiations and discussions, but there certainly felt perhaps that there was some clear consensus that emerged of the need to take stronger action. Whether we've done that is another question, but is this something that can be done, that civil society can mobilize or engage with governments prior to the part 2 of the COP next year to create this sense of urgency or feeling of urgency, perhaps?
I think so. I think the challenge here would be how to mobilize and how to access, the views of these stakeholders, given the severe limitations that are imposed by the pandemic, especially in relation to travel. Last time we talked about how usually in normal times, or at least pre-pandemic times, I don't know what's normal anymore, but in pre-pandemic times, these communities whose inputs we greatly need already have difficulty accessing the international platforms and being talked to by the relevant stakeholders or the relevant representatives of the countries. And these days, with travel severely limited, it will really take a lot of creativity and innovation to get them involved, especially considering, aside from travel and access, they're also greatly concerned about their livelihoods and other, socioeconomic concerns that have been brought about by the pandemic. So it's really, I guess, it's not really top of mind, for the normal person, quote unquote, to be worrying about this. And aside from that, of course, like if we compare it to the Paris Agreement, the process leading up to the actual adoption of the text took 6 years. And even though, the draft text actually came out in about the last year of the preparations for Paris, there were a lot of exchanges already, and there was a lot of trust built, at least by the COP presidency. So it's certainly under the Convention on Biological Diversity, there are a lot of limitations, at least when you compare it to the Climate Change Convention. Not the least being that the COP only meets twice a year, as opposed to the climate COPs meeting once every year, right? So there's all of that. But one way that the climate convention was able to get around the concerns in relation to finding consensus is that if you read the Paris Agreement, it's not really a very prescriptive agreement. They found consensus in adopting a legally binding process and targets, and not really legally binding specific targets for each country. So what they were trying to do is lock countries into a process that all of them would have to follow, but leave the details and the actual specific targets for each country to the country itself. Noting that each country has its own respective capabilities and national circumstances that it needs to take into consideration.
And in terms of going forward, I mean, Nicole, in terms of going forward with the, that post-2020 vision, what are some of the key messages that really are coming out from those discussions, albeit online discussions, and perhaps mostly with high-level NGOs and government? I mean, what are those key sort of visions coming out that we could hope for in a post-2020 vision for biodiversity?
Well, I think what really informs creating that vision is Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which was released last year. So following the 2011 to 2020 Strategic Plan for Biodiversity and the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets, there was kind of a periodic stock take to see how well countries have achieved these. And this was released last year. And in this report, it was found that none of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets had been fully achieved, even if there were 6 that were partially achieved, but on the whole, none had been fully achieved. And I think this challenge really informs how they're trying to put the post-2020 global biodiversity framework together, because they don't want another scenario in which they have these targets and then in the end they're not achieved fully. Right now, the way that the post-2020 global biodiversity framework looks is there's 4 long-term goals which lead up to the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, and then there's 21 action-oriented targets that they look to achieve by 2030. So the framing of those targets differs, and I think this is one way in which it differs a lot from the Paris Agreement, which focused on the process. These are actual targets. Some of them are quantitative, but might depend on an agreed upon baseline. So there are some targets that seek 15% increase in the area or integrity of natural ecosystems. There are some targets that are hard quantitative targets. For example, the one on the biodiversity finance gap, which is going to see a lot of negotiation, we expect, because that's a hard target of closing the gap by at least $700 million by 2030. But there's also targets that are a lot more open and general, like they just seek an increase in monetary and non-monetary benefits from access to genetic resources. So I think the way that and again, those were from the first draft, so we don't even know how much those targets, that structure, and that language is going to change in January. Personally, I think that the real hard, long negotiations will happen in January. Hopefully that can be done in person, but if it can't be done in person, I think there needs to be some way to move the draft forward, because it's been pending for so very long.
And in terms of the Aichi targets, I mean, some people said that they weren't very ambitious to start with. Is there going to be a recommitment to try and meet those targets, or to sort of keep within that framework? I'm always worried if we develop a new framework, we might not. It's always an excuse, perhaps, not to achieve the old framework targets or the old targets.
I think the spirit of the Aichi targets is still in the 21 proposed ones. I think they've just been classified a little differently. I think more than the Aichi targets, there seems to be a greater emphasis in these particular ones on implementation. So there's a whole range of targets that just focus on tools for mainstreaming and implementation. And the biodiversity finance gap is one of those main targets in that regard. All the others, things in the Aichi targets on protected areas, there have been There have been quantitative targets proposed that expound on what the Aichi targets might have wanted to achieve, but it's still not clear whether those will be carried forward.
And so in terms of finance, I mean, that's still obviously been a big challenge for climate change. And I think, you know, in climate change, we've just had the recent IPCC report about the science that indicates that really we've failed on both taking action to try and address a 1.5 degree or C change, but also providing finance from rich countries to developing countries to actually address. And I guess in biodiversity, the gaps seem even larger because people just aren't investing in biodiversity. And I noticed that the Biodiversity Fund that was announced by President Xi Jinping for 233 million or 1.5 billion yuan seems a lot of money. But I also noticed that the investment just over the last half year in the Belt and Road Initiative was about $19.3 billion. I know that in Australia, fossil fuel subsidies every year are about $10 billion, and in the United States, and Europe, they're in the many hundreds of billions of dollars that are subsidising fossil fuels. So I also wonder, in terms of biodiversity finance, you know, where are we going to get the money or the commitment to address that gap?
We're wondering the same thing. I think it's not difficult to predict that finance is going to be a tricky subject to negotiate on. It's usually where all other multilateral environmental agreements get stuck as well. And this has to do really with the amount of money that needs to flow out and into developing countries or into countries that really need the kind of support to ensure that the targets are met. Especially considering that most of these developing countries, like most of the mega biodiverse countries, are developing countries. So if you're looking at the hotspots that really need the funds to be able to protect their biodiversity, the funds are high and the need is high. So that's really going to be a big concern. And looking at these countries as well, you can see that they are also the countries that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, to the adverse impacts of climate change. So that makes their need for resources doubly important. And that's really a challenge that needs to be met. I mean, President Xi Jinping pledged about 1.5 billion won, that's about $233 million for a Kunming Biodiversity Fund. But as you mentioned, there are concerns that, you know, this is a drop in the bucket considering the amount of investments that China has abroad. And even if they've committed internally to no longer fund fossil fuel projects in other countries, that doesn't say anything about, you know, their own projects. So that's something different, rather different in nature, that they haven't gotten specific on. And if you look at, there was a study produced by the Nature Conservancy, Paulson Institute, and the Cornell Atkinson Center for Sustainability, which says that to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030, global spending needs to be between $722 billion US dollars to about $967 billion US dollars per year. So that's a gap of about 824 billion that needs to be filled in, and that's separate. I mean, if you think about how the climate change and the biodiversity conventions are separate instruments from each other, then that might be considered a separate finance need for both, unless there are active efforts to leverage funds for both biodiversity and climate change. So yeah, so the need is great, and the need for speed is even greater. So that's really going to be a pretty challenging matter to negotiate on.
So Nina, I know that you might have to leave us soon, and I'm hoping Nicole can stay on the call. So can we just sort of while we've still got you on the line, just talk about that link between the Biodiversity COP and the work happening in Glasgow with the Framework Convention on Climate Change, because clearly these are linked, and I mean they were known that they were linked back in 1992 when the countries negotiated both the Biodiversity Convention and the Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as my favourite, the Rio Declaration on Environmental Development, and Agenda 21, all of which I think have had significant contributions to the development of environmental law and governance over the last 30 years, but maybe not in terms of impact. We can look back 30 years ago and say, well, we thought we would be in a different place now. Is it the question now, as you say, that time's just run out, we can't have business as usual, and instead of putting billions into infrastructure projects and industrial park developments and build, we have to save, protect, and how do we do that? I mean, and how does that link with some of the discussions going on in Glasgow? If you could sort of give that sort of overview, that would be great.
I think scientific findings, the scientific studies that have been released recently are really showing that, what the path we're on is not sustainable, and we really need to stop and not necessarily make a U-turn, but figure a way out of this place. So, and I think if there's anything that the pandemic has shown is that when the need is so great, that it permeates political will, and political will is really established, and there are a lot of things that can be done to get around things and to try to put forward solutions that will get us out of this problem. The challenge, I think, with climate change and biodiversity is that for years, for decades, the environment has really been considered an external cost to everything that's been done. And trying to include it now in the costs and in the considerations of everything we do is very difficult. It's proven very challenging because we have so many ingrained systemic processes that really have been detrimental to the environment. So that's going to take a lot of political will and a lot of study to ensure that we're doing it correctly. The problem is that we're really, really running out of time, and the amount of study that we need to do, well, if we don't direct the correct resources to it, might not come out until we don't have any time anymore. So it's also really about trying to find the connection between all of these things. Our concern at Parabukas has always been maybe for environmental issues, what people have been looking at, or people have had the tendency to keep trying to address the symptoms and not the root cause of these problems. And that's kind of that's evidenced by the number of multilateral environmental agreements, for example, the number of laws that we come up with to address specific things without fully understanding how they really impact each other and influence each other. The cross-sectoral nature of all of these problems isn't being addressed in a holistic manner, and that's why we tend to keep struggling to solve or resolve the symptoms rather than the root cause of all of these problems. So hopefully, if future legal instruments and future studies have a view to these things, and that might make these massive problems that we can't seem to address or pinpoint the solutions to a bit more understandable and manageable. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. And I think that they're now talking about climate change or as a wicked problem, and perhaps biodiversity loss is the same. And for me, you can look at it all and think, all of these problems are too big, but we know that actually there are solutions, whether they're nature-based solutions, whether they're strict legal solutions to protect. It then becomes, the political way, and I guess also supporting things that work. One question I do have, which is it's a passion for me, is about oceans health, and we've seen the link with global warming, acidification of oceans, collapse in coral reefs, coral bleaching, and the huge impact that has on both the ecosystem as well as those humans that depend on it. Why in terms of biodiversity don't we focus a little bit more on oceans or protecting sharks? Just one of my little particular issues is, the 100 million sharks that might die every year from shark finning. Why do we still allow some of these destructive practices to occur? Is it because it's too profitable? Is it because it's offshore and we don't see it? I'm just trying to work out, just on that issue, if you had any thoughts and ideas, because it's a particular passion of mine.
I think when things happen beyond national boundaries, it's always so much more difficult to not just even apprehend and end things in that way, but to just monitor and keep track. Like, there's so much going on beyond the areas that every country is capable of keeping track of, that it makes these things so much more difficult. And even more so when it's oceans, when the events are both like at the level that we can appreciate, and also underneath, like under the oceans, where we don't have enough say capacity or technology to always be present for monitoring and just keeping track of what's happening. Again, there are efforts to kind of do that there with biodiversity beyond areas of national jurisdiction. That's a specific area of work under the convention, and I think they're also trying to put a new agreement together in that regard. But what we might be able to do now is to strengthen coordination and cooperation between countries, so that they can help each other out in that regard. ASEAN has been trying to do that for a while. The Coral Triangle Initiative is something that's been in the work for a long time. There's a coordinating body on the seas of East Asia that I know looks at another perennial problem in oceans, so marine plastic pollution specifically. So I think like the only way we'll get through this is if we work together. So if that's in this international policy space or in other forms of coordination and collaboration, that's really something we need to keep working on, because we're all in this together, and that's humans and other species as well, I think.
And I think that also ties back with the comments you made when we first came on about relating it to people, relating climate change or biodiversity loss to our farmer communities, to agricultural communities, to coastal communities, so people see directly. And perhaps that's also a problem that a lot of our negotiators and our politicians are separate from nature and are separate from the impacts of climate change. There's always that capacity, I think, to expend money and expend capital to avoid some of these negative impacts. So relating it and seeing people really understanding the practical and actual consequences of biodiversity loss and climate change can be quite powerful. So look, I'd like to thank you so much for your time. Nina, Nicole, would you like to have a sort of a final word? I mean, one of the things that we like to sort of say to our viewers is, well, what can we do? These are wicked problems, they're international problems, they're also local problems. So what are some of the things that lawyers, law students, or non-lawyers, environmental passionate people about the environment can do, and maybe over the next sort of 6 months leading up to the Biodiversity COP Part 2, that we could do to strengthen or to promote some of the issues that we've been discussing today? Nicole, would you like to
Do you want to go first,
Nina?
Nikki?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think something that everyone can do is at least try to learn more. There's a whole lot of material, a whole lot of different different media out there that can teach us a lot about these issues and how they all connect together. I think even for us who've been working in this space for quite a while, there's always something new for us to learn, and we really appreciate that about this work. So I think learning more is a very important first step and can kind of chart the direction of how to engage more. Because when we learn more and the more we understand, I think the more we know what to do or what we can do within our own capacities and communities about these wicked problems that we're all encountering.
I think just to add to what Nicole said, of course, learn more, and I think share as well, like share your knowledge and share especially your experiences, because the more personal experiences are shared, the more we will understand the nature of the problem as it affects different communities, different people. And that's very important in trying to find solutions for these problems. Also, please register to vote and vote wisely in the next election for the Philippines.
Thank you very much, Nina. And indeed, registering to vote and voting always, as people said, every election, if you have the chance to vote or express an opinion or make a contribution, making it clear that it's an ecological decision needs to be made. So look, the last 2 weeks, we've had an exceptional time with our Parabukas colleagues, co-founder of Parabukas, Nana Guiao, and the program director, Nicole Torres. Can I just say, I've learned so much, but more importantly, I've learned and really appreciated the passion you bring and the commitment you bring to the causes of biodiversity protection and climate change. Yet again, we've had some amazing environmental champions on this program, and really I thank you very much from the bottom of my heart, and on behalf of Ariel and the Asian Development Bank Environmental Law Champions, thank you very much for being with us and sharing your experiences, and good luck over the next 6 months. And on that issue, can I also invite everyone to join us again on Tuesday evenings at 6 p.m. in Philippine time. For the next month, November is going to be our climate change month. And so we are going to have interviews with people who are at the COP in Glasgow. We're going to do, hopefully, using technology, some live crossovers, but we'll also have discussions about climate litigation and climate justice over the next month of November, which is going to be very much climate month. But for the last 2 weeks, we have had biodiversity with Parabukas, and on behalf of Ariel and the Asian Development Bank Environmental Law Champions Program, thank you very much and good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you.